Well, welcome everybody this evening to the BMI Victorian History Library. My name is Dennis Carrell and I'm Vice President of the library. The library is located on the lands of the Wurundjeri Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects to elders past and present. Sovereignty has never been ceded. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Just for a few comments about facilities, outside that door, outside this door, just behind where Eva's standing there, are the bathrooms, if you need to use them during the evening. And we have an emergency exit outside the doors to my right, and also the other exit is the way you came in. This year we celebrate a momentous occasion as it marks our library's 170th anniversary. We were established in 1854 and are the second oldest library in Victoria. We have a collection of over 40,000 items and take pride in being the sole library in Australia with such an extensive collection, particularly focusing on Victorian history. Most of our items are available for loan. And if you're not a member already, do see either Ellen or Eva at the end of this evening to make yourself a member. And we've also, just outside the door, we've got a table of books that are related to this evening's talk. And if you would like to borrow any items, speak to either Ellen or Eva at the end of this session. Tonight we also have the wife and son of Bruce Turner, Pamela and Mark. Welcome very much tonight. We hold our Bruce Turner lecture each year to remember the wonderful work he did for our library. Bruce was our librarian from 1984 to 1996 and was the first full-time secretary librarian. We will be taking this on video and it will be on YouTube later on, but if any of you don't wish to be in the film, then just let us know. Before I introduce our speaker this evening, Royce Harris, who's archivist with the Cinema and Theatre Historical Society, I thought I'd tell you about my own first experience with cinema. I lived in Kadina. Anybody know where Kadina is?
South Australia.
Spotted. Are you South Australian?
Unfortunately.
Because usually if I mention Kadina, anybody who's not from South Australia has never heard of it. I was 5 years old, and when the Queen was crowned, the late Queen, and all of us at Kinder were marched down to the movie theatre to see the film of her coronation. This is the first time I'd ever been to the movie, so when the lights went up, I went home, and I thought, well, that was funny, I didn't see the Queen anywhere. And I found out that there was such a thing called intermission, and I buzzed off partway through the show and missed the actual coronation, for which they questioned me about next day at Kinder. Royce tells us that his interest in cinema dates to his primary school days when he used to cut the movie pages out of his grandmother's Woman's Weeklies. I can see that being popular. Needless to say, Royce is in his element in the CATHS archive. Please join me in welcoming Royce as he guides us through Melbourne's Art Deco cinemas of the late 1930s. Now, Royce tells me he's got a lot to say, but we're going to hopefully have time at the end for some questions. Royce.
Thanks very much, Dennis. It's great to have the opportunity to talk about two of my favourite topics, and that's Art Deco and old cinemas. So we'll get started. We'll head back to 1935. As Melbourne emerged from the Depression, its citizens could again afford a night out of the pictures. The suburbs then experienced great growth in new cinemas until this was curtailed by wartime restrictions in 1942. To put Australian cinema going into context, In 1928, Australia was second to the USA in ratio of cinema seats per head of population. In the USA, it was 1 for every 18 people, and in Australia, we had 1 for every 22 people. In Europe, it was 1 for 50. By the end of the silent era, Melbourne had built giant picture palaces such as the Regent and the State, which both had more than 3,000 seats. These were very highly decorated buildings. That's the interior of the Regent, which had a Spanish Gothic theme. And the State, which we're still familiar with, was in the atmospheric style, and inside it was very cluttered, statuary and everything, and even that wall up the top there, that was actually painted bright blue. So they were quite fussy looking buildings. Attending a film at these and other city theatres was a big event which involved dressing in your best clothes, possibly a restaurant meal before or afterwards, and of course the trip to the city. As they recovered from the Depression, people have become more frugal and preferred to stay closer to home for entertainment. As the almost compulsory focus of movie-going moved to the suburbs, the great cinema chains stopped pouring money into palatial city cinemas and began instead to focus on updating the local cinemas. Saturday night at the pictures was one of the few opportunities for social engagement. In the days when the average suburban family didn't own a car, many households had regular bookings at the local cinema, regardless of what was showing. The new cinemas were built close to Melbourne's tram and train lines. Advertising often emphasised how easily they could be accessed. This one's Windsor, just around the corner, and that doesn't focus all that well, unfortunately, but they pointed out in this ad, which is right on the train line. The building was quite spectacular on the corner, apart from the way the Windsor Theatre was written up the top, which I thought detracted from it quite a bit. The next ad we've got was Hartwell. I like that ad. It shows its position on 2 tram lines and the Hartwell station. I think if you were coming up Glen Iris Road in this truck, you'd be having a bit of trouble, but flying down Camberwell Road, you probably got there early. The Brighton Dandy made sure they had all bases covered. They were right next to the station. They put in the other 2 stations, North Brighton and Brighton Beach, 500 yards from the St Kilda and Brighton Beach trams. This is my favourite for the opening program for the Padua in Brunswick. Shows the Sydney Road tram line. Whoops, we've lost the light somewhere.
One second.
It's all right, I can still read my notes. They sort of make it look as though Brunswick was the centre of the earth, I think, the way they call the globe there. We haven't got time to look at them at the moment, but there's some interesting little things here. And this one I like down the bottom here. Taxi driver yelling out the window at a woman with a pram and a baby in it and said, "Why don't you take the kid to the crying room at the Padua?" So, in contrast, actually, to the highly decorated buildings of the pre-Depression era, the new cinemas emerged in a simpler, modern style. The luxury picture palaces were deliberately designed in a style that the cinema goers couldn't feel any part of, like an exotic other world. But the European trend in the 30s was towards simple interiors where costly decoration was eliminated. The pared-back style suited the new cinemas being built in Australia, some of which only held 800 to 900, and the owners were definitely budget conscious. The now well-used phrase Art Deco didn't actually come into usage until the 1960s, so the builders of these theatres didn't even know they were building Art Deco theatres. The name derived from the 1925 Paris exposition, and that's actually a flyer used to advertise the exposition. Many variations of the style developed, particularly in the 1930s, which are now collectively called Art Deco. But the main style of Melbourne's late 1930s cinemas was what came to be called streamline modern. And occasionally in the advertising, you'd see it was written as streamlined, but the Art Deco, as I say, didn't come into effect till much later. Several architectural firms specialised in this style, and we'll examine them all as we look at the individual cinemas. But there was a commonality in most of them, with several features which had not previously been seen. Most of them have been examined in separate articles in our Cinema Record magazine. The first was the crying room, which I mentioned before, which enabled a mother to see the movie and feed her child without annoying all the other patrons. The top right-hand one there was the crying room at Brighton, Dendy. That's the crying room window over there, so it was quite pointed and you could see it. The photo down the bottom was for Hoyts Albury, but it was a sort of a typical crying room photo. The firm of H. Vivian Taylor and Soilo like to include some distinguishing features in each of their cinemas, which was subjected to the usual low budgets of suburban theatres. Mostly this is seen in their spectacular freestanding modernist ticket boxes. We'll look at those as we look at each cinema, but the top left one is the one on Padua in Brunswick. Number two is the Hardwell Regal, which was likened to the Eiffel Tower. And the bottom two were, once again, the Windsor just up the road. Many of the new cinemas also had impressive terrazzo flooring with contemporary designs in a variety of colours. Its durability was suited to high traffic areas such as the foyer. The common feature of many was the stylised insignia of the initials of the theatre in the terrazzo. In some of the positioning of the ticket boxes, that didn't allow for the insignia. The Windsor, which we just looked at, overcame that by having the word Hoyts right outside in the terrazzo on the street. Elaborate programs were produced for some of these theatres, particularly the larger ones designed by Taylor, Soilo and Overend. And it's interesting to compare the features. That was the cover of the Brunswick Padua one, which was very eye-catching. We've actually got the original in one of the display cases there. And they all featured things like crying rooms and roof gardens, which hadn't been seen before. Possibly the first new cinema of the new wave was the Camden in Caulfield South, which opened in October 1935, and it was designed by the architectural firm of D.F. Cowell Ham. The Camden was soon followed by the village in Toorak in March 1936 by Charles Hollinshead. It's mistakenly thought that nowadays that was the first of the chain of village theatres, but it was actually named for the Toorak village. And the next theatre which opened, as you'd probably be familiar with, was the following month in April 1936 by R. Morton Taylor, the Astor. These cinemas in the emerging Art Deco style were all very different to the pre-Depression cinemas externally. They were mostly square or rectangular with right-angled walls, compared to the streamlined buildings which were soon to follow. But internally they had many Art Deco features which set them apart from the cinemas built only a few years earlier, features which were carried through in new and renovated cinemas up till the war years. That's the corner of the Toorak village, which shows the new, simpler pared back look compared to what we had looked at before. Before we go on to the main feature, we'll have a look at the experience that drew audiences to their local theatres. For popular movies on Saturday night, it was best especially to reserve your seats. These are all from our archive from the Sun Theatre in Yarraville. Special envelopes to have them, which would be waiting for you at the box office if you'd reserved your seats. Seats down the bottom show you could have front stalls, back stalls, lounge or dress circle. And Saturday night, these were booked out in most of the cinemas. Hoyts published a magazine, Screen News, which was only a penny and a very big seller, and it contained a list of their current releases. This is from a 1941, and it lists all the Hoyts cinemas that we're discussing tonight. The program changed on Wednesdays and Saturdays and took about 6 weeks to play the full Hoyts circuit. After being welcomed on arrival, you were shown to your seat by an usher or usherette. This group photo was the staff at the Regent Theatre in South Yarra in 1935. That cinema actually opened in 1925, so predates the Art Deco cinemas, but the staff would have been similar. The photo was given to us by the daughter of one of the ladies sitting in the front there, and was very proud of her mother's job. And the cinema manager was looking extremely proud of his staff. I think he gave them all one of these photos for Christmas. In 1935, you can see how well dressed they are, all the ushers with their white tops and bow ties, and lolly boys on the end, and the commissioner at the middle at the back to welcome you and greet you as you arrived. This is a program for the Metro in Bourke Street. Suburban theatres didn't usually have such detailed free programs because the film changed twice weekly, but the program would have been similar to this. And you can see on the top part over there, they had a live orchestra, which most of the suburban ones didn't have, but some did. But then they started with a newsreel, some features like a Pete Smith specialty, a travelogue, and probably a cartoon. The number of extra features depended on the length of the movie shown. The program was always a double feature, usually with the main film shown after the interval. There's a sign you won't see these days. Very un-PC now. At interval, ice creams and chocolates could be purchased from the tray boys who were conveniently placed around the auditorium. In Victoria, Peters and Senate's were the two main popular brands of ice cream. A lot of people would still remember the Senate's Bear, I think, that came out of the Film Chat magazine. Chocolates and lollies also. If you're lucky enough to get a packet of Fantails, you could sit there and read all the wrappers on the toffees as you were waiting for the cinema to come up. If you needed to stretch your legs, then you got to pass out for the usher and went outside for a cigarette or purchased drinks and chocolates from the candy bar. That's a great photo of the Waverley Theatre in East Melbourne, with the candy bar right in the foyer at the steps to the lounge upstairs, and it's got the WT for Waverley Theatre on the floor there in the terrazzo, which I was talking about before. If you were very lucky, you didn't just have a packet of Fantails, but you got a box of old gold chocolates. Then for interval, when you got your pass out, a lot of the theatres had the sweet shop, right, like that says there, at the theatre entrance. The sweet shop was sometimes inside the same building or next door, and it was always rushed. There's the Hoyts Glen Huntley. The facade had been remodelled, but not in the Art Deco style, but I put that in there to show the lolly shop right next door, and actually it would have had an internal entrance into the theatre as well. So they were extremely busy places at the interval. Val Morgan, if you're familiar with everybody who'd seen the old Val Morgan ads, And we've got a great collection of these in the archive, but I put a couple in here that are near this theatre. Mrs. Wellington, ladies' hairdressers in those days didn't even have first names, but Mrs. Wellington would do your permanent wave right near this theatre. And Curly, I don't think it's Curly from the Three Stooges, but he looks a bit like him. And that was in Bridge Road near this theatre, so probably Curly was in Richmond, I would think. Now we'll go back and have a look at each of the individual theatres. In February 1937, Hoyts reported they'd allocated £150,000 for the erection of 5 new theatres and modernisation of existing cinemas. That was their aim at the time. They emphasised the architectural finish and appointments in the modern streamline motif. So there's the word streamline does actually make it in there. Modern without the E on the end, but they were using the terms. And that was what they thought they were building, modern theatres. It wasn't, no mention of Art Deco. You can see down in the bottom left corner, that's that spectacular ticket box from the Windsor, which they used in all of their, they even copied that in other theatres. There was one in Perth that was identical to that one as well. Hoyts, the two architectural firms that were responsible for most of the Hoyts cinemas, H. Vivian Taylor, Soilo and Overend, were in charge of designs for the new front-ranking houses, and Cowper, Murphy and Appleford were responsible for the smaller second-tier designs. Hoyts had been impressed by Cowper Murphy's rebuild of the 1936 Majestic in Flinders Street for Union Theatres. And this image shows the interior of the foyer at the Majestic with these new Art Deco type designs. Now, as mentioned, the first of the really new theme for the Hoyts theatres was the Windsor. It opened in April 1936, the same month as the Astor, which was a bit further south on Chapel Street. They were both medium-sized theatres. The Windsor had 1,395 seats and was slightly smaller than the 1,690 seats in the Astor. The interiors of both were typical of the streamlined decor of the time. That's the Windsor. The Windsor received a lot of coverage in the trade and the architectural magazines, particularly with the ticket box like that. It's what amuses me, that's the crying room. It looks like it's got about half a dozen seats and a teddy bear in the back, but that was the first one. And as they say at the top, an appreciated consideration. And that was soon extended and used in a lot of subsequent movie theatres. By the end of 1936, the first two Cowper Murphy and Appleford theatres had opened. The Vogue in Hawthorn in May was the first. The Vogue was an independently owned, reasonably small theatre of 1,100 seats. It was well positioned on a corner site though. I really like the ones on the corners. That was the interior, you can see it sort of fanning in. And that's the ad for it from soon after opening, where they emphasised the corner position once again, and the little stick-figured crowds all rushing into there. The next one to open was on Boxing Day in 1936, and that was the Waverley in East Melbourne, which we saw the photo of the lobby before. It was another independent built near the corner of Waverley and Burke Roads. It had 1,150 seats. The opening program stated, just here, I think you can still read out the third paragraph. I like this one. Where am I? Yeah, it said that one can experience the feeling of walking on clouds when you imagine you'll find your feet sinking into the soft yielding carpet. And there's a photo of the upstairs, and you can almost see yourself sinking into that carpet, actually. The Waverley closed in 1958. That was the interior of it. Closed in 1958, and the ABC took it over, and they were there until 1994. These photos were taken on a CATHS inspection in 1996 before it changed hands. And they're very rare because there were very few colour photos. Building magazine had a lot of detail about the colours, but all the photos were black and white, so you sort of had to imagine them. But this one here still looked like that in 1996. So the colour, we presume, was similar to what they would originally have been. It's now been converted to retail in a 22 apartment complex, but the shell on the facade still remains. It is still recognisable as a picture theatre. This one was one I wish I would have been able to see. 1937 saw the openings of the first two of the H. Vivian Taylor Soilo and Overend cinemas, both on prominent Main Street sites. The Padua was well located on Sydney Road, Brunswick, and it had 1,800 seats, which is fairly big for the suburbs, on 2 levels. The massive bullnosed front of the modern theatre in cream brick with recessed bands of vermilion stood out amongst the older buildings of Brunswick, and the Padua became renowned as the most prestigious theatre in the district. Among its many features was the crying room. We saw the ad for that before. It had foot warmers to all seats, and a unique floating screen and revolving stage. There was also a roof garden overlooking Sydney Road. That's quite a glamorous looking interior. That's from the opening program. When the doors open, the Padua Theatre springs to life, and that's the ticket box, which I mentioned before. It got quite famous, that one. It was a streamlined contemporary teardrop shape, sometimes described as a futuristic speedboat. And it actually doubled as a whale in the foyer display for Moby Dick when they did that. They decorated as a whale. Very elaborate program was produced for the opening. Oh, whoops, sorry. We'll go back to that. Which had the cover before. And it depicted all of these features. Sadly, the large theatre was uneconomic after the arrival of television, and after a period showing continental films, it was demolished in 1982. And it's actually got an Aldi supermarket on the site now. And the Regal in Hartwell was another of my favourite ones, which I wish I had seen. It was on a V-shaped block on the corner of Toorak and Camberwell roads, and it was built to take advantage of the shape of the site. The building was variously described as resembling an ocean liner, or Building magazine said it was like a battleship. That was in the opening program, which was also in one of our display cases down here. And they also had one of the most significant ticket boxes, in this case unique in its conception, that said, this was in the Building magazine, said, unique in its conception anywhere in the world, which reared itself with massive streaks to the ceiling where it was almost lost in glorious pools of light. It was also described as resembling the Eiffel Tower. Building magazine also described the velvet velour curtains imported from Vienna of varying textures which catch the play of colours, lights and shades, and which supplies quite an entertainment while waiting for the feature. This unique theatre closed in 1959 and was soon replaced by a service station. That was the opening for it. Seems a strange thing to me. Ramona with Don Amici playing a Native American, and Cecily Court and Gin Everybody Dance, which was an English musical. And on the opening day, you had Shirley Temple and 6 Mickey Mouse cartoons, so they were catering for the whole district. That was a pass out which we've got. I'm afraid it's no use trying to use that before because it's now a service. Oh no, it's no longer a service station. A lot of these were replaced by service stations, but since in these days, service stations have gone out of fashion as well, and they're no longer there, aren't they? And these all seem to be ones I say I wish I'd seen, but I really do wish I'd seen this in Albert Park. It's hard to tell in the photo, but behind the Hoyt sign down the corner, that was all glass brick, so it was all in glass brick, which was quite spectacular. The Argus described it as the most modern theatre that Hoyts have erected in the last 6 years, with seating for 1,600. The circular corner tower of glass bricks is illuminated from within, and the sides are of cream brick. It had all the usual modern features. That's a great looking foyer with another signature ticket box, Saul's entrance behind that, and then upstairs to the lounge. This one was really good. Another unique innovation was the Hammond organ, which was a new type of electric organ manufactured in the USA, which produced the organ sound without the organ pipes. Building magazine described how the auditorium had small balconets protruding. You can see it there. There's one pointing there. That's the organ there. And they had small balconets protruding over the side aisles, one of which housed the Hammond organ. They said this contains a curtain which is drawn back, revealing a revolving platform which swings the organ into mid-air. After the opening presentation, the organ takes its former concealed position and the symmetry of design is restored. The Age said the organ mysteriously disappears into the wall. So that must have been a curtain similar to those others which came down over the Cape when the organ went there. The other innovation, that's the interior of it. Quite spectacular looking back up to the I/O box. And this must have been the dress circle foyer. And the innovation there was the South Sea Bar, which the Age called the Hawaiian drinking room, copied from the Mexican Hotel in Hollywood. I've got a feeling it was probably that over there. I think that looks like a palm tree. And the description of that in the Age said the scene is of palm trees leaning over yellow sand bathed in sunshine. Rain falls on the roof of the bar and rushes over the eaves. The illusion of a tropical storm being increased by the accompaniment of sound effects courtesy of thunder amplified through the PA system. So that would have really been something, but you can tell, and the decoration on the roof of that is quite spectacular, that one. If there was ever any doubt as to how impressive these theatres were, look at this photo. That's the theatre in Albert Park. I think it was probably taken from the roof or balcony of a cinema over near where the Kinema Theatre was on the other side. But it really was an impressive looking building. It was demolished for another service station, believe it or not. And then that was later demolished and the library's now on that corner in Albert Park. But it was quite spectacular, I think. 1938 also gave us two smaller cinemas from Cowper Murphy, the Circle in Preston and the Sun in Yarraville, which you can still see. The Sun's most eye-catching feature was its sunburst neon sign, highly visible above the Yarraville skyline. The front facade was originally illuminated by floodlighting, with the tower surmounted by a flashing sun in red and gold. This is out of the Film Weekly. The photocopy's not that good, but you can see that was it. Neon lighting illuminated the name of the theatre in cut cement at the top. It opened in April 1938 and seated 1,200. It was claimed to be the first cinema to introduce a parabolic section floor which dispensed with the traditional stalls and circle division. It all went back in one sweep like that. The auditorium contained a honeycomb diamond arrangement with diffused lighting. The terrazzo floor of the entrance foyer actually had a very large theatre insignia which still survives, and I've got a shot of that later on. The other one, which opened in November 1938, was in Preston, and that looks quite a great looking photo too, with the Cadbury sign prominent in their lolly shop. It contained 925 seats and was built to a stadium design similar to the Sun, so it wasn't on two levels either. The entrance was by staircase from the left of the main foyer, which featured circular features as well, and the usual terrazzo floor. And that's the auditorium there, those semicircular motifs adorning the walls there in patterns in the plaster relief. This one was demolished in 1976 and replaced by an arcade of shops called the Circle Arcade. Most of the architects covered so far were for the firms engaged to build the expanding Hoyt circuit, but there were other architects and firms active in designing cinemas for the independent exhibitors, and there were a lot of those. Robert Lepore Terry, who operated in other fields as well, made some interesting cinematic contribution. An early one was a makeover to the Crystal Palace in Caulfield, a large square building which opened in 1921 on the Princes Highway near Caulfield Station. So close, in fact, that passing trains could be heard and the vibrations were felt in the front stalls. The makeover there in 1936 streamlined the interior. Had quite a short one. I think the lighting was probably there, but they couldn't do much with the outside. But the auditorium received the full Art Deco treatment, which was well publicised by the architect at the time and led to a lot of similar jobs. So it was Art Deco on the inside and 1921 on the outside, and there it was just before it closed, when it had become a downward storage depot. Another major renovation at the same time was the Trocadero in Footscray. It had been built in 1914, but it was given a major modern renovation in 1939. That included the creation of a balcony lounge and replaced the central stairs with two side stairs to the balcony foyer. I really like that photo of the exterior, which they were able to put a new one on. And I think they probably parked those cars in front to give us effect too. These days, looking back, it does date the photo. And it was completely refussed with the name emblazoned across the top in that Art Deco lettering. The same architect was responsible for the kinema in Albert Park, which was virtually across the road from the park that we looked at earlier. It was a refit of an older cinema which had opened in 1920. And they had a few problems calling it when it was being redone. It finally opened as being called the New Kinema. That's the exterior. The building magazine, it was calling it the New Riverina. That's in quite a good book where it was called in building magazine, the New Riverina. And as the last paragraph says, they captioned the exterior of the New Riverina, but the building still had a neon sign saying Kinema. So it had a little bit of an identity crisis, and that building is still there too, but it's not really recognisable much as a cinema anymore. Over in Preston, this is one that we haven't been able to get photos of from the time. There's a sketch of the Planet Theatre in Preston. when was that one opened? 1939, had a modest modern theatre as exterior, but it included the usual climbing room, and unusually it had on-site parking for patrons. We hadn't been able to get a photo from the time, but that was it a few weeks before it was demolished. Painted over, the cinemas look quite different, and we don't have one with its original colour scheme. The same architect also designed the Unity Theatre in Edithvale, which is a reasonably small theatre, which is also still there, but it's painted a whole matte grey colour now and looks nothing like that. But it was painted white and was an op shop for many years, and it still exists. Then we come to a real theatre again instead of the renovations, and that was the Rivoli, which everyone will be familiar with probably. Vivian Taylor and Soilo again. 1,644 seats in Camberwell, and it opened in 1940. It replaced a nearby cinema of the same name. Building Magazine and the Daily Press gave it extensive coverage to its modern design. A striking feature of the fibrous plaster is the grille work on the side wall, which served to cover the air conditioning ducts. And that side wall illustration was from the opening program. And although the main auditorium was split in 1968 when the main cinema was twinned, one up and one down, that side wall still looks virtually the same. That's a photo that was taken in this century. So the same design is on there. The opening program is another good one. The roof garden. I can't imagine even in 1939 that the patrons were dressed quite like that, but the profusion of flowers and shrubs, I don't think they lasted all that long either, but that was from the opening program. That was the entrance foyer, and that is still recognisable in the Rivoli, the two circular staircase down the end. Oops, we're going on to the Dendy. I'll come back to the Rivoli at the end because it is still there, but the terrazzo floor there had been covered in a renovation by a carpet, and they discovered that back in the 80s, I think it was, when it was being renovated at some stage. And also the ticket box had been replaced too, but you can still see where that was on the floor too, on the current one. Cowper Murphy and Appleford's Dendy in Brighton opened in November 1940. It seated 1,120 and included the crying room, which we saw the photo of earlier. The exterior was of cream brick with bands of pink and a chocolate-coloured base, according to Building Magazine. So I think it said that the two vertical fins and the tall centre feature were rendered white, and the name was raised cement painted red. So it's obviously had a bit of a change since then. Judging by the car, we're probably into the 60s, but the basic cinema was still there. The usual floor and the lollies and everything in that one too. That's quite a good looking design in that floor. Building Magazine, one of the most mentioned features of this one was the flowers on the ceiling. The petals of each flower are picked out in colour with a small electric lamp in the centre of each to bring up the colours. Main lighting is from two parallel troughs which run the full length of the centre of the ceiling. So that would probably be quite spectacular when they were all twinkling in different colours. Inlets in the ventilation and heating system are concealed behind large grilles on each side of the proscenium and behind the two parallel lines of the ceiling treatment. This original theatre was partly demolished in 1984 and has been replaced by a 5-cinema new building. In the early years of the war, people were looking for escapism and cinema attendances were at an all-time high. Hoyts managed to build 2 final cinemas before the advent of war saw building materials in short supply, and much of the population were either in the armed forces or occupied by war work. But they commenced 2 theatres almost simultaneously close to each other in the eastern suburbs. The first to open in June 1941 was this one, The Time in Melbourne, by Cowper Murphy and Appleford. It was once again my favourite corner position and took advantage of that with a wide cantilever awning covering the footpath on 2 sides of the entrance doors. And that gave it a sweeping foyer there with a central ticket box. Building magazine noted the drop ceiling, which appears to be supported from the centre of the ticket box so as to form a canopy, an excellent example of fibrous plaster modelling. So it's a bit hard to tell from that photo. The big vases of flowers are also, bloody hell, were very popular in all of these cinemas when they opened. They had a big urn full of buds in most of them. There's your cheats. Now, I'm not quite sure what a seat check only was, because it wasn't your ticket. And that was the interior again. It had 1,166 seat auditorium in stadium style. So that was along the one that's looking the opposite direction from the ones that we saw, like the Sun. So that's looking from the top. So there was no upstairs and downstairs. It was all in one go. And the other theatre that they built at the same time was the Mailing in Canterbury, which was a replacement for the Aging Canterbury Theatre on the opposite side of Mailing Street. Interestingly, the Mailing is still there. Oh, sorry, the old theatre is still there, but the Mailing was long gone. It was smaller than the time. It had 942 streets and it lacked the street presence of the Ballwood building. It was sandwiched between shops with an understated facade highlighted only by the usual Hoyt's vertical neon sign, which illuminated the building at night. We don't have a shot of that when it was in its prime. That was actually taken when it was closed and it was about to be demolished. The interior was in the modern style, though. That was the interior of it, which is rather unusual. It was designed by Hollinshead, who had built the Toorak. The Toorak cinema was one of his few, but he did this one as well. And the proscenium in their write-ups was defined by unusual stacks of circular-shaped drafts. So there's lots of circles in there too. Then the Second World War put an end to Hoyt's second construction boom, and the Mailing was the last new screen that they'd built for 30 years. Cowper Murphy had one last wartime cinema, the little-known Roxy in Maidstone. The small cinema of 750 seats. It was partially built in 1942 on Ballarat Road. It looks quite similar to the Preston one there in the photo, I think. It was partially built in 1942 and was taken over by the Naval Armaments Board, and they used it during the year, and it was finally opened as a cinema in 1945. And in 1958, that's the interior once again with the stadium type seating. Opened in 1945 as a cinema, and in 1958 it was one of the very first to close after television started to spell the end for the suburban cinema's golden years. I've covered the new cinemas of the late 1930s, but several existing cinemas were also modernised at the time to enable them to compete with the new buildings, in addition to the Caulfield Crystal Palace and the Footscray Trocadero, which we've already described. Hoyt's renown in Elstonwick was one. It was built like that in 1916. but it was given a new facade in 1940. A feature of that renovation, similar to the Trocadero in Footscray, was the lettering, Art Deco type lettering, large cutout letters spelling the name, emphasising the new modern theatre. After another modern renovation was to the Plaza in Ormond, which had been built in 1927. It closed in 1940 for a major rebuild by architects Marsh and Michelson. That included the installation of a ceiling over the dress circle and a crying room at the back of the stalls. Seating had been increased to 998. It's a very plain looking Art Deco type cinema, that one. It wasn't always possible or desirable to alter the facade, but other theatres were given interior refurbishments with the new style. One of these was the Glenferrie in Hawthorne, a very early cinema built in 1912. It had been operating as a dance venue by 1938, when architects Cowper Murphy and Appleford were engaged to return it to a cinema. It had a very wide frontage to Glenferrie Road, which included 5 shops. The Edwardian facade was simplified, but the big changes were inside. A plaster skin was wrapped around the existing walls, giving room for ventilation and heating ducts and lighting, which emphasised the designs. The decor was very much in the Art Moderne style. In 2015, it was converted into the Lido multiplex cinema that's there at the moment. Sorry, getting a bit dry up here. During the rebuild, we were lucky enough, CATHS, to tour the partly renovated building, and we could see traces of the previous lives. It had been theatre restaurant upstairs, and you can see probably the blue background would have been the original colour, and there would have been an internal wall which they just painted straight over with, looks like house paint in the red colours. But it was very interesting seeing it and seeing where all the bits and pieces fitted in. The same architect renovated the National Theatre in Richmond in 1939, and again, the exterior received little attention, but the auditorium received a full Art Moderne treatment. That's from Building Magazine, and you can see that they covered the Glen and the National in the same article, and the ceiling treatment in that looks almost the same as what we just saw in the Glen. Moonee Ponds got a renovation as well. This was an interesting one. It was the subject of a number of renovations through the years. It had been opened in 1911, so it was a very early cinema. Cowper Murphy and Appleford renovated the auditorium and proscenium in 1937, but that was quite a more conventional or traditional and had none of the Art Moderne features used in their other cinemas at the time. But the same can't be said for the next renovation by Harry S. Winbush in 1940, and that was the exterior. This comprised mainly a new treatment to the facade and foyer. The Argus described this modernised facade as having a main central panel flanked with large masses of cream brickwork. The central feature comprised 6 large return flutes, which are lighted by a scheme of indirect lighting. Must have lit up the whole suburb, I think. It had a large double-sided enamel sign running up the centre, and background lighting at night highlighted the letters in sharp silhouette. So that was in Buckle Street, Moonee Ponds, and there's the building now. Unfortunately, the building's still there, but all that Art Deco facade has been removed, and that's what it currently looks like. Cowper Murphy and Appleford contributed several other interiors. The Eclipse in Port Melbourne in 1938 wasn't really an Art Moderne cinema, but there were highlights of it in the interior. You can see it in the light fittings and horizontal wall panels there. And an interesting one was the loco in North Melbourne. Some of you might be familiar with that. The building is still there. It wasn't able to have the exterior substantially altered because it's in a 3-storey building erected in 1914 as the premises for the Australian Federated Union of Locomotive Engineering, or enginemen rather. But the interior was subject to remodel. That's out of their own locomotive journal from 1939. It had an addition of a crying room, floating screen, and very modern looking wall fixtures. Interestingly, that's a good photo of it. And recently CATHS was able to inspect this one and found that. And those wall fittings at the top there, which covered the air conditioning, is the same as the one on the very right-hand side there. So the interior has been retained to quite a bit.
Just conscious we're almost at.
Yep, I'm almost there. That's still the logo there. You can still see the logo on the top. As I said earlier, building of new cinemas was curtailed by wartime activities and material shortages, and it was the early 1950s before many new theatres were built. Often in newly developing areas, these were much simpler buildings, and the architectural side of the Art Deco era were very much a thing of the past. Sorry, I can't read the clock from here, but if our journey tonight has made you long to see some of these grand buildings, there are still a few reminders of the era in the Melbourne suburbs. Unfortunately, great cinemas like the Padua, the Hartwell Regal and the Park are long gone. The Astor in St Kilda didn't have the same conventional art modern exterior, but the interior retains many features of the era. The terrazzo tiled floor has a large star design on which the ticket box used to sit, and that's still there in the foyer. The open well in the upstairs foyer is also a feature of the downstairs foyer. And the Astor's unusual in that it has retained double-storey upstairs and downstairs. The Camberwell Rivoli and the Yarraville Sun also retain much of the era. They are both vastly altered inside and converted to multiple screens, but much of the original buildings remain. The original auditorium of the Rivoli was split into 2 cinemas, one above the other, in 1968, but much of the original was kept. And the new cinema is in the building on the right-hand side there. It's still got a roof garden, but none of those fancily dressed people seem to be there anymore. And the foyer still looks fantastic. It's there. The ticket box is missing, but you can still buy your ticket over the other side there if you haven't bought it online. And this is the Sun in Yarraville. Got that great insignia on the floor. And there's the best known feature was their sunburst, and that's still in place and remains an iconic photo, iconic sign for the whole district. And that's where we end our tour.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Royce.
Thank you.
A small thank you from the BMI Victorian History Library.
Thanks very much.
If you're not on our mailing list, please see Eva and make sure that you, or Ellen at the end, just make sure that you are on our mailing list. Or if you'd like to be a member of BMI Victorian History Library, please sign up. And as you probably gathered, CATHS is located just around the corner here. Their office, if you ever want to visit.
Yep, we're usually there a couple of days a week.
Yeah, a few days a week. Just a few, we are at 7:30, but just any questions before we finish off? Perhaps put the lights up too, if you wouldn't mind, Eva. Any questions?
No?
Oh, there's one that's right towards the back. That's you. Yeah.
Thanks for that. That was a really fantastic talk. Thank you. Are there any remnants of the demolitions that you know of that exist anywhere, or like light fittings or?
Very few, most of them, nobody deemed it back in the late 50s or early 60s, deemed anything was worth saving there. Some private people have souvenir bits and pieces, I think, but I don't know that there's much that actually survives. Do you know, David, whether there's many remnants?
There's a few bits and pieces,
Yeah.
one or two in my shed.
Yeah, it's a pity, but buildings the size of the one in Brunswick, the Padua, and that were just a liability after people stopped coming and staying home watching their television. So they weren't even there worth preserving or anything, unfortunately.
Were the crying rooms the exception or the common factor?
They became quite common after they put them in there, and even the newer ones like Reservoir, which was built in the 50s, still had a crying room, so they were quite common, yeah. They were quite well referred to in the advertising and that too.
How common were theatre organs?
Not in the suburban, or not many in the suburbs. They had them in the city theatres, and the Hammond organ that I mentioned there was in a couple of them. That looked quite spectacular, the way it used to swing out over the auditorium and back again.
So there's still a Hammond organ in the Capri Centre in Adelaide that functions. Are there any left here in Victoria?
I think there's one. The one that was in Brighton, where it went to the
And
capital.
that's gone back to the capital.
It's definitely an organ in the capital. I was there
That
last
wasn't a
weekend.
Hammond organ,
That
that
was
was
the theatre organ.
Just one question or comment about the lights at the Dendy. The flowers on the wall and the ceiling were actually put there for acoustic treatment. They're for acoustic treatment. The sound there was excellent, and the colours, they do use blue and green through the summer to keep you cool, and red and orange through the winter.
Oh, really?
Oh, yes. Yes.
Oh, very good.
And he also had his concept of air conditioning. I saw the ad there, said the first air conditioner. He had sprinklers on the asbestos roof, and he would sprinkle the roof, and that would cool the theatre.
Oh, right. That must have been similar to what they were saying with the park.
Yes.
Yeah.
Any last questions? Not? Well, thank you all very much. We had a full house tonight. Thank you all very much for coming, and thank you again, Royce, for an excellent.
Thank you.